The sun's rays gently filtered through the curtains, painting the room a warm gold. Mrs. Adela Reynolds, an elderly black woman, sat at the window, looking out at the busy street. Her trembling hands were carefully adjusting the handkerchief in her lap. This day was going to be a milestone in her life, the first flight in 10 years. The trip she had put off for so long, to visit her daughter and see her newborn grandson for the first time. Her weak legs could no longer support her body, and the wheelchair became a constant companion. But, despite this, her eyes shone with determination. In her 72 years, Adela endured many hardships: the struggle for rights in her youth, the bereavement of her husband, and a long illness that robbed her of her mobility. But she always found the strength to go forward. This day was to be a celebration, a symbol of her resilience. She carefully placed a few pictures of the family, a keepsake album for her grandson, and the letter she'd written to her daughter the night she'd found out she was pregnant. Adela smiled as she imagined her strong arms encircling the baby's tiny body and felt her heart fill with warmth. Her packing was unhurried, with every detail taken care of. Her papers, her medication, a couple of books she was going to read on the plane. Her caregiver, a young girl named Carla, helped her pack and reassured her not to worry. "Everything will be fine, Mrs. Reynolds," she said with a smile. "You deserve this trip." In the back of her mind, however, Adela felt an inexplicable uneasiness. She was not superstitious, but something oppressive hung in the air today. Perhaps it was just fear of flying, she consoled herself, or the memories of long ago injustices that sometimes swooped in and ruined even the brightest day. When the cab pulled up to the house, Carla helped Adela into the car and placed her wheelchair in the trunk. The ride to the airport was quiet, but tension continued to build. Mrs. Reynolds checked several times to make sure she hadn't forgotten her papers, hugged her bag tighter, as if trying to hold on to her hope. Upon arrival at the airport, everything went wrong immediately. The staff at the entrance took a long time to find a suitable ramp for her wheelchair. They looked at each other, exchanging dismissive glances, as if her presence were a burden. No one offered to help until Carla got into an argument with one of the employees. Adela was used to situations like this, but this time it seemed especially humiliating. When she finally reached the check-in area, her gaze crossed for a moment with the pilot's eyes, a man in a white uniform with a cold, piercing stare. He looked at her appraisingly, lingering his gaze on her wheelchair. His eyes read contempt. Adela flinched, but pretended not to notice. She had seen such looks too many times and had learned to ignore them. But this time, something in that look made her inner voice cry out, "Watch out!" She didn't know yet that this day would be the worst day of her life. The crowd in the check-in hall was buzzing like a giant beehive. People scurried back and forth with their suitcases, glancing nervously at the flight board. Adela and Carla approached the check-in desk slowly, trying not to attract attention. As soon as they got closer, however, it was clear that their presence would not go unnoticed. At the counter stood a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a smile that seemed to disappear as soon as she noticed Adela in her wheelchair. Her gaze slid over the wheelchair, then over Adela's face, and finally stopped on Carl, as if waiting for an explanation. "Good morning," Carla began cautiously. "We'd like to check in for our flight to Atlanta." The employee nodded coldly, her fingers beginning to tap lazily on the keyboard. Her tone was sharp and irritated. "Do you have confirmation? Will you be registering the stroller? Please hurry up. There's a line here." Carla frowned, but pulled out the paperwork. She patiently explained that Mrs. Reynolds was a disabled elderly woman and would need help boarding. However, her words didn't seem to reach the employee, who looked more and more dismissive with each response. "We don't have to make exceptions, you know," she cut off, turning Adela's passport over as if she were holding something unpleasant. "If she can't get up the ramp, it's not our problem. Maybe you should have thought ahead." Adela, accustomed to restraining her emotions, felt her throat constricted with humiliation. She stared at the woman in silence, feeling her every gesture and word leaving a painful mark. Carla started to object, but the employee had already looked away, indicating that the conversation was over. "To the next one," she said sharply, as if Adela wasn't a person at all, but some problematic burden that she wanted to shed quickly. Carla insisted that they head to the assistance desk for disabled passengers. There, however, they received another cold reception. The uniformed man, clearly annoyed, didn't even look at Adela. "What do you want?" His voice was hardly aggressive. "We need a ramp and boarding assistance," Carla said firmly. The man sighed loudly, rolling his eyes. "Look, we're not running a charity here. The ramp's taken. We'll have to wait. Or maybe not even today," he added with a wry chuckle. These words elicited quiet laughter from the passing employees. Carla clenched her fists, her face red with anger. She was about to reply when Adela put her hand gently on her shoulder. "It's okay, Carla," she said quietly, though her voice shook. "We'll be fine." But she didn't really feel good. She felt like she was being looked at, like she wasn't a person but a problem, an inconvenience, a burden. She tried to remember the last time she had felt so humiliated, and she couldn't. Her heart clenched, but she didn't want to show weakness. They waited for more than an hour until finally someone deigned to roll up the ramp. Each step was accompanied by unhappy looks and grumbling. As Adela was being lifted onto the plane, her wheelchair got stuck and one of the staff members pushed her roughly, muttering, "Why do they even put people like that on airplanes? They're just a nuisance." The words pierced her like a knife. Adela clenched her teeth to keep from crying. She'd always prided herself on her resilience, but now it felt like the world was united against her. When she was finally in her seat, she had only one thought. How would she survive the flight? And she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Adela sat in the chair, trying to catch her breath after the humiliating scene at the airport. Her hands were still shaking with tension, and she could feel the fatigue slowly overtaking her. Carla sat down next to her, her face tense. She whispered that she was going to go check the flight details with the crew. A few minutes later, the pilot appeared on board. He was tall, in a perfectly pressed uniform, with a cold stare that seemed to pierce through. His appearance usually drew respect and calm from the passengers, but not today. As soon as his eyes stopped on Adela, his expression changed. He stepped closer to where Adela was sitting and said deliberately loudly, "Okay, what kind of special privilege is this? We're not here to give a cruise to people who can't even climb on their own." The words sounded like thunder. The passengers sitting nearby began to look around. Some pretended not to hear, but some looked at the pilot in surprise. Carla returned just at that moment, her face flushed with rage. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" she asked, standing up. "Is this normal behavior for an aircraft commander?" The pilot crossed his arms over his chest and smiled with slight disdain. "I said it's not our job to give rides to whoever we want, especially those who can't even get on an airplane by themselves. Maybe your ward doesn't realize how much time and effort went into just getting her here." Those words cut Adela like a blade. She clutched the armrests of her chair, trying to cope with the anger and humiliation. Carla took a step forward, but the pilot continued without letting her open her mouth. "I hope she has all the paperwork. Wouldn't want anyone here to cause a delay." "Papers?" Carla gasped with indignation. "She's a passenger like everyone else." "Oh, really?" The pilot threw Adela a look of contempt. "Then maybe she should act like everyone else instead of making us all fit in." Adela felt tears come to her eyes, but she refused to let this man see her weakness. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't mean to be a burden." The pilot grinned, as if her words only confirmed he was right. "Well, at least you admit it," he cut off and turned around to leave for the cockpit. For a few moments, there was an oppressive silence in the cabin. Everyone was in shock, and some of the passengers began to whisper. Carla was ready to scream, but Adela stopped her with a glare. "Don't," she whispered. "Just let it be over." But deep down, she realized this was only the first step in the nightmare that lay ahead. The plane was preparing for takeoff, but the atmosphere in the cabin was far from calm. Tension hung in the air like a thick fog. Adela sat in her seat, trying to remain calm, but her breathing was heavy and her heart was pounding in her chest like it was trying to escape. She was already regretting her decision to take this flight, but it was too late to back out. As the flight attendants began preparing passengers for takeoff, a new problem arose. It turned out that Adela's seat was not comfortable enough for her condition. She cautiously asked Carla to get someone from the crew to help her change position. Her legs were starting to get numb, and each second in the uncomfortable position brought more pain. Carla approached the flight attendant, who reluctantly listened to the request and nodded lazily. But after a few minutes, no one still hadn't shown up. Then Carla insisted on talking to the pilot. She knew it was a risky move, but the situation demanded determination. When the pilot finally emerged from the cockpit, his face immediately darkened with irritation as soon as he saw Carla and Adela. "What is it this time?" he asked gruffly, crossing his arms over his chest. Carla explained the problem calmly, trying not to raise her voice, but her firmness irritated the pilot more and more. He interrupted her without even listening. "Look, I'm not going to waste my time trying to please everyone who can't handle themselves. You do realize this is an airline, not a nursing facility?" Carla was taken aback by his words but tried to object. "You have an obligation to get her help. It's your job." The pilot laughed, but there wasn't an ounce of humor in his laughter. "My job is to fly the airplane, not cater to people who shouldn't be on board. If she's having such a hard time, maybe she should have stayed home. Or, rent a private jet if she thinks she's so special." The words made Adela's throat lump. She remained silent, but her hands clenched the armrests of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely powerless. "You have no right to say that," Carla replied firmly. "It's discrimination. We can file a complaint." "Complaint?" The pilot raised an eyebrow sarcastically. "Good luck with that one. Who's going to believe you? An old woman in a wheelchair who can barely speak and her assistant? You have no idea who you're dealing with." The words came like thunder to Adela. She looked up at the pilot for the first time and said quietly but confidently, "You may think you're stronger than I am, but I have seen empires crumble, and I know how quickly those who think they are invincible fall." The pilot grinned, but a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. He turned away, throwing it back as he went. "If she can't sit still, maybe we should move her. somewhere away from everyone." These words sounded like an order, and the flight attendants began discussing how to move Adela to the back of the plane. Some of the passengers became indignant, but no one openly interfered. Adela felt fear and humiliation mixing inside her into a single lump. But this was just another round of the nightmare that wasn't going to end. She took a deep breath, fumbled for her cell phone in her pocket, and, after making sure the pilot was gone, began quietly dialing 911. Her voice was shaky but firm. "I'm a passenger on flight 347. I'm being discriminated against and humiliated. I'm an elderly, disabled woman, and I need help." At the other end of the line, she was listened to attentively. Adela knew that she had taken the first step in defending her honor and dignity, but she had not yet realized how terrible this battle would become. The plane gained altitude, and the noise of the engines drowned out the awkward silence that hung in the cabin. Adela sat motionless, trying not to meet the eyes of the other passengers. Despair was building in her chest, but she stubbornly refused to let herself cry. Her hands were in her lap, clenched into fists, as if that would keep her from collapsing under the weight of humiliation. The silence was broken by the pilot's voice coming from the speakers. "Welcome to Flight 347. He began with ostentatious friendliness. "We have a very special guest on board today. So special, in fact, that we took longer than usual to board her. I hope you realize that sometimes you have to sacrifice convenience for occasions like this." The passengers began to glance around, some with surprise, others with barely concealed irritation. Adela felt her cheeks flush with heat. She realized the pilot was talking about her. Carla looked up sharply, her eyes burning with anger, but Adela quietly put her hand on her shoulder, begging her to let it go. The pilot, however, was not going to stop. After a while, he appeared in the cabin, walking along the rows as if he wanted to see for himself if his words had had an effect. He stopped at Adela's seat and smiled with frank contempt. "How are you, ma'am? Is everything all right? Is there anything else we haven't considered?" He said so loudly that the whole cabin heard. Adela didn't answer, trying not to meet his gaze, but that only irritated him. "You know, I keep thinking," he continued, turning to the others. "Maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Sometimes it seems that such passengers are better off staying at home. What do you say, colleagues?" He glanced at the two flight attendants standing next to him. One of them hummed, the other grinned and said, "Yeah, next time have him charter a private jet. It's not a cruise ship." There was laughter all around. Some of the passengers turned away, pretending not to hear. But there were others who whispered indignantly, shaking their heads. One young man with a serious face looked at the pilot and said loudly, "Will you stop it? She has a right to be here like everyone else." The pilot frowned, but quickly pulled himself together. "Of course he does," he answered with false courtesy. "I just wonder why such special guests feel that they should receive so much attention. And you, sir, I would advise you not to interfere. You don't want your flight to be uncomfortable, do you?" The man muttered something but stopped talking, realizing that his words wouldn't change anything. Carla could barely contain herself at that moment. Her fists were clenched, her face flaming with anger. But Adela stopped her again with a quiet look. "You don't have to," she whispered. "Don't stoop to their level." However, Adela's patience was coming to an end. She felt a mixture of humiliation, anger, and fear boiling up inside her. Every comment from the pilot, every laugh or scornful look from the passengers cut her like knives. Her hands fumbled again for the cell phone hidden in her pocket. She knew she'd already made the 911 call, but now she wanted to do more. wanted someone to see it. Carla, meanwhile, rose from her seat and said loudly, "Enough! You're humiliating a disabled elderly woman in front of everyone. Is that your idea of professionalism?" The pilot turned to her, his face darkening. "I don't have to listen to your lectures. If you don't like it, you can always leave the plane." "Oh, yes, we're already in the air. That's a shame." These words caused a new burst of laughter among some of the passengers. Adela could not be silent any longer. She raised her head, her voice firm, though quiet. "You can go on, but know that the truth will always find its way out, and the world will know who you really are." The pilot laughed, but his laugh was nervous. A shadow of anxiety flashed in his eyes. He turned and walked away into the cockpit, but the tension in the cabin remained. Adela closed her eyes and quietly told herself she would not give up. Her struggle was just beginning. The atmosphere on board became oppressive. The passengers glanced furtively at Adela, some with sympathy, others with indifference or even irritation. Carla did not move a step away from her, her tense figure as if to say that she was ready to fight at any moment. But no one had expected the nightmare to take such a sinister turn. It all started when the pilot reappeared in the cabin. His face was contorted with irritation and his eyes were flashing with lightning. He no longer seemed to be trying to maintain any semblance of friendliness or professionalism. "What's going on here again?" he shouted, stopping beside Adela. "Are you guys going on strike on board?" Carla tried to interject, her voice sounding calm but firm. "We're not organizing anything. We just want Mrs. Reynolds to have a normal flight. She deserves respect." The pilot grinned, but there was nothing friendly about his grin. "Respect?" He leaned closer to Carla. "You know what deserves respect? The work of a crew that has to waste time on—" He paused, gesturing to Adela. "This." These words caused a quiet murmur among the passengers. Some whispered indignantly, but no one dared to stand up. Adela, sitting in her wheelchair, tried to maintain her dignity, but her heart clenched with pain and anger. She slowly raised her head and looked the pilot straight in the eye. "You're out of line," she said quietly, but her voice sounded like a clap of thunder. These words seemed to make the pilot mad. He stepped closer, and before anyone could realize it, he shoved the wheelchair in which Adela was sitting. The wheelchair jerked forward, its front wheels flying off the floor, and Adela almost fell out. "If you're having such a hard time, maybe you should think about how to cope," he shouted, his voice ringing with anger. There was a cry of shock in the salon. Carla rushed to the stroller, grabbing the handles in time to keep Adela from falling. "Are you out of your mind?" Carla shouted. Her voice shook with rage. "You attacked an elderly woman. Do you realize that this is a crime?" But the pilot didn't stop. His face was red, and he stepped even closer and shoved the baby carriage again, making it spin in place. "Maybe you should learn to respect the rules," he shouted, not noticing how his own behavior was spiraling out of control. "Or maybe it's better not to fly at all." Adela clutched at the armrests, her eyes full of terror, but she didn't say a word. She didn't want to give this man the satisfaction of her fear. Panic broke out all around. Passengers jumped up from their seats, some shouting outrage, some pulling out their phones to film what was happening. "This is too much," shouted the young man, the same one who had tried to stand up for Adela earlier. "It's not just discrimination, it's assault." One of the women in the back of the cabin stood up and shouted, "Call the police. This man should be arrested." The pilot, realizing the situation was spinning out of control, looked around. His confidence began to falter, but he quickly tried to regain his mask of equanimity. "Everyone to your seats," he shouted, addressing the passengers. "This is an internal crew matter, and none of your business." But his words meant nothing. Some people had already called the police, some were filming what was happening, and others were loudly expressing their indignation. Adela, meanwhile, quietly picked up the phone she had been holding all this time. The other end of the line assured her that the police were on their way and that she should stay calm. "They'll come," she whispered to Carla. "They'll see everything." Her voice was shaky, but it was firm. She knew she had made the right choice, but there was a question in her heart. What more could this man do before he was stopped? Adela felt her heart pounding in her chest as if it were about to burst out. Her hands trembled and her breathing became labored. She wasn't sure her body could take the strain. The pilot's attack, his harsh words and abusive treatment, had been like a thunderclap. She had lived a long life, enduring many hardships, but she had never experienced anything like this. Her mind was clouded with fear and humiliation, but in this chaos one ray of light shone through. She must act. She must call for help. Slowly and carefully, so as not to attract attention, Adela reached for her phone. Weak fingers struggled to hold it as she activated the screen. Carla noticed the movement and leaned toward her. "Are you all right?" "What are you doing?" Carla whispered, her voice filled with concern. "Calling," Adela answered, her voice weak, almost lifeless. "They have to know. Someone has to know." She dialed 911 and put the phone to her ear. The line connected almost immediately, and the operator's calm, professional voice said, "911, what can I do for you?" Adela tried to answer, but her voice traitorously trailed off. She took a deep breath to regain her strength and spoke in a shaky but firm voice. "This is Flight 347, Skyline Air. I'm an elderly disabled woman. I'm being assaulted by the pilot." The operator froze for a second before asking the next question. "Are you safe now? Can you describe what is happening?" Adela glanced at Carla, who nodded at her as if giving her the strength to continue. He pushed me, my chair, twice, said I shouldn't be here, that I'm a burden." Her voice shook, but she couldn't stop. "I'm afraid he might do something else." "We are sending the police to your airport, madam," the operator said confidently. "I am staying on the line with you. Please breathe calmly. Is there anyone around who can help you?" Carla took the phone from Adela's hands and added, "I'm her chaperone. This is a very serious situation. The pilot is using racist language, humiliating her, and he's clearly violent. We need help immediately. She's not physically able to take it." "The police have already been notified. They will arrive at the time of landing. Please stay with her," the operator replied. Adela heard this answer and felt some relief, but her body was showing signs of exhaustion. Her breathing became even heavier, and her heart was pounding so hard that she feared she would pass out. Her age and health didn't give her the right to be so worried, but she had no choice. Carla noticed her condition and quickly got some medicine out of her bag. "It's going to be okay, Mrs. Reynolds," she said, trying to sound confident, but her voice shook. "Hold on. They're on their way." As Carla helped Adela drink her medicine, the tension in the cabin continued to rise. Passengers began to openly discuss what had happened. Some loudly condemned the pilot, some complained about the delay, and some recorded what was happening on their phones. The pilot himself had returned to the cockpit, but it was obvious from everything that he was aware of the gravity of the situation. His face was flushed with anger, but he tried to maintain a semblance of control. He had already started to receive messages from the controllers demanding explanations about what was happening on board. Adela, despite her condition, remained strong. She knew she had made the right decision in calling for help. Her call was the beginning of what was to be the end of this horror. She closed her eyes again, trying to regain her strength. Every breath came with difficulty, but hope burned in her heart. She knew the truth was on her side, and the world needed to know what she had been through. Adela sat in the airport seat, her breathing still heavy, but now she knew she was not alone. The police were already waiting at the landing site, and the pilot, who had behaved insolently and aggressively since the beginning of the flight, had been taken away for questioning. But justice had not yet been fully served. When the plane landed, Adela's family, her daughter Elizabeth and son-in-law Michael, arrived at the airport. Elizabeth looked determined, her eyes burning with anger, and Michael was calm, but his presence radiated confidence. Elizabeth already knew everything. Carla had called her from the flight as soon as the humiliation began. "Where is my mother?" she asked loudly as she approached the exit area. Her voice sounded so loud and confident that the airport staff could not ignore her. Carla greeted them immediately, her face anxious, but she sighed in relief at the sight of her family. Elizabeth rushed to her mother, her eyes filling with tears as she saw how weak and exhausted Adela was. "Mom, what did they do to you?" she asked, leaning over to hug her. Adela smiled wearily, her voice weak but firm. "I'll be fine, Elizabeth," she replied, "but I won't let them get away with it." Michael, who was an attorney with extensive experience in civil rights defense, was already springing into action. He approached the police officers who were handling the case and said firmly, "I represent Mrs. Adela Reynolds. This case is not just a violation of a passenger's rights. It is a gross manifestation of racism, disability discrimination, and physical abuse. We will demand full accountability for those responsible." The officers, surprised by his push, listened politely, but Michael didn't stop. He contacted members of the press who had already gathered at the airport after the video from the airplane began gaining traction on social media. Footage shot by passengers showing the pilot roughly pushing Adela's stroller went viral, sparking a wave of outrage across the country. Elizabeth, not hiding her anger, spoke to reporters. "My mother is a strong woman who has spent her life fighting injustice, and even in her years she shows more dignity than this man who was supposed to keep her safe. We will not let this go unpunished." Journalists asked questions and took pictures of Adela, who, despite her fatigue, proudly told her story. She did not dodge questions, she did not hide her pain. Her voice was quiet, but there was a truth in it that touched everyone around her. At this time, airline representatives were trying to salvage the situation. One of them approached Michael and quietly offered to talk. "We sincerely regret the incident. We are ready to consider compensation and settle the matter." Michael looked at him coldly. "Compensation? You're offering money for humiliation, for injury, for the fact that the person you trusted to fly the airplane assaulted a passenger? It's unacceptable." Elizabeth supported her husband. "We will seek a public apology and a full investigation. This pilot must be suspended, and your company must review its standards to ensure that nothing like this happens again." The airline was in a panic. Reputational damage was inevitable, and they realized that this story would not just go away. More and more people gathered around and support for Adela grew. Passengers on the flight who had witnessed the attack started coming up to corroborate her words. "It was horrible," said the young woman who recorded the video. "He humiliated her like that, and then he pushed her." We were all shocked. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the case. The police began to investigate the incident more thoroughly, and the press stayed close to Adela's family. She herself, despite her weakness, found the strength to speak. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. It has to stop." Adela's family became her trusted shield and sword, defending her honor and fighting for justice. This battle was just beginning, but they knew that together they could achieve the truth. The buzz at the airport subsided as police cars pulled up to the airplane ramp. Their flashing lights drew the attention of dozens of passengers and employees. People froze, wondering what was going on. There were whispers in the crowd, and all eyes were fixed on Flight 347, around which the drama was unfolding. The uniformed police came aboard with a firm, businesslike expression on their faces. Their badges reflected camera flashes. The press had already taken up positions, waiting for a high-profile arrest. Passengers who had witnessed the incident held their breath as the officers headed straight for the cockpit. There was a loud knock on the door in the cabin. "Open up, police," came a firm voice. A few seconds of silence, then the door opened. The pilot looked annoyed but tried to keep his composure. His expression was arrogant, as if he couldn't believe that he was really guilty. "What kind of circus is this?" he asked sarcastically, looking around at the police officers. "I don't understand why you're here." The officers wasted no time in explaining. One of them took a step forward and said firmly, "You are suspected of physical assault, verbal abuse, and discrimination. Please follow us." The pilot grinned, looking at them with challenge. "An attack?" His voice got louder. "That's ridiculous. I was just doing my job. That woman, she's just too sensitive. You saw the crowd around here. They're always looking for someone to blame." He tried to justify himself, his tone becoming more and more irritated. But the police were not about to get into an argument. The officers took a step closer, and one of them said, "We've already obtained witness statements and video footage of the incident. Resistance will only make your situation worse." The pilot grinned again, but now there was something like worry in his eyes. He glanced at the flight attendants as if looking for support, but they averted their eyes. No one dared to stand up for him. The atmosphere in the cabin was tense, and the air seemed to grow thick with resentment. When officers asked him to stand up, he took a step back and said loudly, "This is some kind of mistake. I haven't done anything that deserves to be treated like this. I'm a 20-year pilot. Do you realize what you're doing?" But no one cared about his words anymore. One of the policemen took out the handcuffs and calmly said, "We understand, sir, but that doesn't excuse your behavior." The pilot tried one last desperate move, saying that he was an honest worker and that this woman was just looking for ways to sue the airline. However, his voice no longer sounded as confident. At some point, he realized that resistance was pointless. When the handcuffs clicked on his wrists, the cabin erupted in applause. The passengers who had been watching finally felt that justice had been served. A young woman who was filming the video got up from her seat and shouted, "Serves you right. You humiliated her, you pushed her around, and now you're going to get what you deserve." The pilot, now with obvious fear in his eyes, was let out of the plane. The police followed him, and his uniform, a symbol of authority and responsibility, now looked ridiculous. He was no longer the confident man who had bullied the elderly woman. As the pilot was led off the plane, Elizabeth, Adela's daughter, stood in front of the crowd of journalists. Her voice was firm and loud. This is the first step towards justice. This man thought he could humiliate and attack my mother because of her skin color and medical condition. But today, he realized that no one else would allow such behavior. Adela, sitting in the chair, looked at it all with a sense of relief. Her heart still ached from the experience, but she knew her struggle had not been in vain. The police, the support of her family, the anger of the passengers all became her shield in this battle. As the pilot was being taken away, she said quietly to Carla, "I thought I would never see justice. But today, I saw that even the strongest can fall when the truth is on your side." Her words sounded like an echo that filled the salon. She knew there was still a long way to go, but this moment was the beginning of the end for those who thought they could humiliate and insult with impunity. Immediately after the pilot was led away in handcuffs, passengers sitting in the cabin began sharing videos and photos of the incident en masse. The internet has seen scandals at airports and on airplanes many times before, but what happened on Flight 347 was something completely different. The first videos published on social media captured the moment when the pilot rudely pushed Adela's wheelchair. His harsh words, the hurt dignity of the elderly woman, and the outraged screams of the passengers triggered an avalanche of comments. In just a few minutes, the hashtags #Justice for Adele and #Skyline Scandal filled Twitter and Instagram. A young woman sitting in the back of the cabin recorded a particularly poignant moment. When Adela quietly but firmly told the pilot that the truth would always find its way out. The video became a symbol of the fight against discrimination, and thousands of people began sharing it with comments like, "She is stronger than the whole crew of this plane," and "a hero of our time." Passengers who were initially afraid to speak out openly now wrote their stories under the posts, adding more and more details. One of them wrote, "I was on that flight. What the pilot did is unacceptable. He assaulted an elderly disabled woman and no one from the crew stopped him. This must be investigated." The video gained millions of views and people started demanding an immediate response from the airline. Thousands of comments started appearing on Skyline Air's official accounts, accusing them of inaction and demanding a public apology. The public reaction was immediate and powerful. Television began broadcasting reports involving Adela's family. Elizabeth and Michael gave the first live interview in which they talked about what had happened. "Our family never thought we would face such blatant racism and discrimination," said Elizabeth. "My mother deserves respect just like anyone else. We will get justice." This interview was brought to the attention of human rights organizations. Prominent activists and lawyers expressed their support for Adela. One of them wrote on Twitter, "This is not just a case of assault. This is an example of how discrimination continues to exist in our system. We must all come together to stop this once and for all." Events quickly became international in scope. Media outlets around the world began to cover Adela's story. Her face, full of dignity, became a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Meanwhile, Skyline Air tried to minimize the damage. The company issued an official statement expressing its deepest apologies and promised to conduct an independent investigation. However, this only increased people's anger. They felt that an apology was not enough and demanded concrete action, firing the entire flight crew, compensation for Adela, and a change in company policy. "We will no longer be silent," wrote one of the activists. "This story is not just about the pilot. It is about how systems allow such people to feel unpunished." Adela, sitting in her daughter's house, watched it all from a television screen. Her poor health would not allow her to participate in all the events, but her story continued to inspire millions. At one point, she turned to Elizabeth and said, "I thought my voice didn't mean anything in this world anymore, but now I see that sometimes even one voice can be heard." "Mom, you're more than a voice," Elizabeth replied, hugging her. "You are a symbol." Adela's story was a lesson for society. Her resilience, the support of her family, and the outrage of thousands of people proved that even in the darkest moments, it is possible to find light and justice, and that light was now visible to the world. The days following the incident on Flight 347 were eventful. The public demanded justice, human rights organizations called for systemic change, and Skyline Air found itself at the center of one of the most high-profile scandals in the history of civil aviation. After days of silence, the airline announced that they had completed their internal investigation. In a press release, they confirmed that the pilot's actions were inconsistent with corporate standards and values. The result was the immediate termination of the pilot's contract. Skyline Air sincerely apologizes to Mrs. Adele Reynolds and her family for our employees' unacceptable behavior, the CEO said at a press conference. "We are also committed to reviewing our internal policies to ensure that something like this never happens again." These words were accompanied by a public offer of substantial compensation for Adela, as well as a promise to develop an employee training program to combat discrimination and increase sensitivity to passengers with special needs. For Adela and her family, however, this was not enough. Elizabeth and Michael, who had now become voices of the movement, took the initiative to create a foundation supporting the rights of people with disabilities and fighting racism in the transportation sector. "This situation must not happen again to any person," Elizabeth said at a rally organized by human rights groups. "We will work to make airlines and all public institutions realize that discrimination and violence are unacceptable." Michael took on the legal side of the issue. He began preparing a lawsuit against Skyline Air to establish this case as a precedent. The lawsuit demanded not only compensation for Adela, but also mandatory industry-wide standards of service for passengers with disabilities. Adela's story has been an inspiration to millions of people around the world. Under the hashtags Justice for Adele and Rights for All, actions were held where people told their stories of discrimination. Many companies began to revise their policies to avoid such scandals. Adela, at home with her family, watched the events unfold. Her face, which had become a symbol of resilience, was now smiling, but her eyes still showed the depth of her experience. One evening, sitting in an armchair and looking at pictures of her family, she said, "I never thought my voice could make a difference. But now I know that each of us has the right to be heard, and each of us has the power to make the world a better place." These words, spoken in a small living room, went viral when repeated by Elizabeth in one of her interviews. Adela Reynolds' story became not just an example of fighting injustice, but a symbol of change. A pilot who thought his power allowed him everything was ousted. An airline that didn't care about its passengers was forced to change, and the world saw that even one voice, quiet and weak, can be the beginning of a loud revolution. This is how the story ended, but its lessons lived on, reminding everyone that the fight for rights never ends. Friends, we would love to know your opinion in the comments. Have you faced such cases of injustice or racism in your life? How did you deal with it? Your stories are important to us, just like each of you. If you were touched by this story, please like and subscribe to our channel. We value each of our viewers and strive to share stories that change the way we see the world. Did you listen to the end of this story? Write about it in the comments. We'd love to know that it resonated with you. Thank you for being with us. May your day be kind and full of inspiration.